One of the biggest things that we talk about in AI ethics is the alignment problem. That is to say, how do we make sure that AI, whatever it turns out to be, aligns with our values? How do we make sure that it behaves in accordance with our ethical values? That's a hard question to answer. One of the biggest strategies around is to make the AI itself, or at least attempt to make AI itself, capable of engaging in ethical inquiry. So, what's the right thing to do now? What's the good or the bad thing to do now? Can we get AI to do that kind of thing? Now, it's an interesting strategy, but it's actually quite controversial by the lights of many philosophers. So, this is the point that my guest today, Tristram McPherson, he's a professor of philosophy at Ohio State University, tries to bring out. He thinks that anyone engaging in this strategy of trying to get AI to look into what's ethically right and wrong in a given situation and behave accordingly or perhaps advise accordingly is a very, at least philosophically, fraught strategy. More specifically, he thinks that it requires making certain very large substantive assumptions about how ethics works and what's ethically true, which sort of brings me back to my old days as a philosophy professor, because this is the sort of realm of philosophy that I specialized in at the time, really focusing on what the heck is ethics anyway. I want to I want to bring out a little bit of what that ethical landscape looks like. And I think that if you understand what that landscape looks like, you'll be better able to follow, understand, digest, and appreciate the really interesting points that Tristram is making. What I'm just going to call levels of ethics. So at that very first level is what philosophers tend to call applied ethics. When you're talking about applied ethics, you're talking about what's right and wrong in a given situation or for a particular kind of act. So for instance, trying to figure out the moral permissibility and permissibility of abortion is an applied ethics issue. Trying to figure out whether euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, is ethically permissible, and if so, under what circumstances. That's a case of applied ethics. So that's, if you like, the most zoomed in ethics that we've got. That's like a microscopic look within the realm of ethics. If you zoom out, you find yourself at what's called normative ethics. And normative ethics concerns itself with more general theories about what makes right things right, good things good. For instance, you might find various kinds of principles here that you should do. The right thing to do is whatever creates the most amount of happiness in the world, right? So it's a more general principle. It's not dealing with any particular kind of case. It's saying, here's how ethics works. Here's another one that you might be familiar with. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? The golden rule. That's all the normative ethics realm. We can actually zoom out again, one more time, to another level of abstraction. And now we're going to ask, wait a second, what do we mean by something is right? What do we mean when we say something is good? Wait, are there facts of the matter about what's right and wrong and good and bad? Or is it just a matter of opinion? Is it just how we feel about things? So now you can see this is the realm of what's called meta-ethics. And you can see that when you're doing meta-ethics, you're certainly not doing applied ethics where you're talking about, is abortion right or wrong? Is euthanasia right or wrong? Is capital punishment right or wrong? And you're not even trying to say these are the good things and these are the bad things and these are the wrong actions and these are the right actions. You're trying to figure out, how does ethics work? What is rightness and wrongness? What is goodness and badness? Are there facts about it? Is it cross-cultural? Are there universal truths about it? If there are ethical truths, how do we come to know them? So all that stuff is meta-ethics. In the first half of the conversation with Tristram, we're going to be having a conversation about the kinds of assumptions that those researchers engaging in that strategy of getting AI to engage in ethical inquiry, they're making at least 4 substantive meta-ethical assumptions. So Tristram argues, and I think he's more than likely right about this. They're making certain kinds of meta-ethical assumptions about how ethics works. That's the first half of this conversation. The second thing that I want to draw your attention to is this distinction within meta-ethics. There's 2 kinds, very roughly speaking here, 2 kinds of meta-ethicists. There's the realists and there are the anti-realists. And the realists think, yeah, there's truth to the matter about ethics. There's truth about what's good and bad and right and wrong. It's not how you feel about stuff. It's just, this is true that, let's say, genocide is bad, that rape is morally wrong. These are just facts. These are facts that are, I feel like, just as facty as that, I don't know, New York is to the north of Florida, or the earth revolves around the sun. and rape is wrong, right? There are ethical facts just like all the other facts out there. So that's a position that a lot of people take in metaethics. And then there's another kind of metaethicist. We call them anti-realists. And they're the ones that are like, no, there's no ethical truths out there. There's nothing that's, if you like, objectively right and wrong. When we say that something is right and wrong, we're doing something else. Now, things begin to get very complicated here. I don't want to get too much into the weeds in this introduction, but you'll hear us use the word non-cognitivism or the phrase non-cognitivism a bunch. And just know that non-cognitivists are types. They're a type of anti-realist. They're among those people who think, yeah, there's no truth and falsity to the matter here. When you say something is good or bad, rape is bad, you're doing something like saying, boo, rape. It's something along those lines. The way that you say, boo, I don't know any sports teams, unfortunately. Boo, New York Mets or whatever. It's not true or false that boo New York Mets, and it's not true or false that rape is bad. But when you say rape is bad, you're expressing that negative attitude you have towards them in a way that a sports fan might express a negative attitude towards the Mets. Okay, so that was already a lot. Remember, we've got these distinctions between applied ethics. That's this particular kind of act, right or wrong. You've got the middle layer, which is normative ethics. What are the things that are good and bad and right and wrong? And then you've got this meta-ethics stuff about how does ethics work. And within meta-ethics, you've got the realists and the anti-realists. And one type of anti-realist is the non-cognitivist. I know that's a lot. You're going to get more of this as the conversation goes on. So you'll have time to, if you like, onboard these concepts. But I wanted to give you a heads up on these sorts of things. The first half of our conversation, as I said, is about metaethics and about the kinds of metaethical assumptions that those AI researchers who want to align AI with our ethical values are making. There are 4 very big metaethical assumptions that they're making. And just to give you a quick preview, it's things like they're assuming that there are ethical facts for the AI to discover. They're assuming that the AI has the capacities to actually identify them. And then there's another one that once it discovers, let's say it discovers the ethical facts, that it will actually care about them. Those are 3 of the 4 big assumptions that Tristram identifies. And one thing to say about them is that each and every one of those claims is a highly controversial claim. Tristram is actually sympathetic to all those claims, to these metaethical assumptions, but they're highly controversial. The second half of our conversation is about the normative assumptions. So now we're moving from metaethics to normative ethics. The key normative assumption that Tristram thinks that these AI researchers are making hinges on the thought that humans have moral worth. That's a claim, right? That's a normative claim. It says something to the effect of humans have a certain moral worth, a certain dignity, a certain status, such that you can't just treat them however you want. They're not inanimate objects that have no value. They have intrinsic value or intrinsic worth or something along those lines. And then this raises really interesting questions about what about other kinds of creatures? Does all biological life have equal moral worth? If so, that might not be great, because suppose an AI comes along and says, let me make the most valuable things. And it increases the quantity of biological life out there by killing a bunch of humans and letting the insects flourish or something along those lines. If, on the other hand, moral worth comes in degrees, such that, let's say, the intelligent stuff is worth more than the less intelligent stuff, for instance, humans are worth more than mosquitoes, then if AI turns out to be way smarter than us, is the AI justified in crushing us in the way that we crush mosquitoes? This gets very complicated. We get to a place where we have to think about ethics where I think most ethicists, professional philosophers, are a little bit, I don't want to say stumped, but this is hard material to work through. And it comes about by thinking about the ways in which we try to enact what appears to be, putting technical difficulties to the side, a legitimate strategy for making AI ethical. So that's just a high-level overview. I'm just trying to highlight certain concepts and ideas right now, and they'll get a lot more color on them as I talk with Tristram. Okay, so that's the talk I'm going to have with Tristram. And by the way, just a personal note, Tristram was actually an editor at a philosophy journal back when I was a philosophy professor, and he was the best editor that I ever had. He was extremely patient. He read the blind reviewer stuff. He read my stuff carefully. He gave really helpful feedback, and eventually it got published in no small part because Tristram was such a great editor. So Tristram, thank you so much for not only coming on the show, but for being such a great editor back in the day. Okay, if you haven't realized it yet, I am your host, Reed Blackman. The show is Ethical Machines. If you like the podcast, then do the things you're supposed to do. Right now, I don't know, take your phone out and just hit 5 stars. It's not a big deal. I'll wait. Ready? 1, 2, All right, I'm not going to wait the whole time. Just go do it. And then also, if you have anything that you want me to talk about, people you want me to talk to, please email me at em@readblackman.com. And also, if you like this, you might like my book, also called Ethical Machines. Go buy that thing. Go rate it 5 stars. You can go to my Substack, readblackman.com. No, what is it? readblackman.substack.com. Just go do all those things. For now, you know what? I'll tell you what. For now, just rate the podcast 5 stars and we'll move on. You can do the other things another day. All right. Enough of that. Let's go talk to Tristram. So, Trish, I take it that one of the things that people have in their heads or as their goals when they're training up an AI, especially if they're talking about something like AGI, is they want to make it sensitive to ethical values. They want to make it a moral agent in some sense. And I take it that, or one way you might try to do that, is to try to get it to be like us. Try to engage in ethical inquiry to figure out what's morally right and wrong. And if we can do that, then we'll have solved this fear that AI is going to go off and destroy us all. And from what I gather, you think that is a kind of deeply problematic endeavor for a variety of reasons. Is that right?
Yeah, that's pretty close. Let me just talk a little bit about where I'm coming from. I'm somebody who spends most of my time thinking about very abstract theoretical questions and the foundations of ethics. And when I think about this issue, one of the first things that strikes me is how many assumptions in the foundations of ethics that you need to make in order for that strategy to go smoothly. And so I'll just talk about a couple of those assumptions. And then the second thing I'd like to talk about if we get there is, I think even if you get all those assumptions in place, we still have some things to worry about that I think are actually really interesting.
You mean the strategy for avoiding catastrophe, which consists in getting the AI to itself be a kind of ethical inquirer?
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
So you could call that kind of autonomous AI inquiry, if you liked, like getting the AI to do the ethical inquiry itself. So one thing that needs to be in place, if you think that we're going to get better results by doing this than just by telling the AI what to think about ethics, is there's going to have to be some ethical facts, right? Very crudely. Like if you have a view on which like there are no ethical facts, on which maybe some kind of very simple non-cognitivism is true, or some kind of error theory is true, on which like, we're trying to talk about ethical facts, but there just aren't any, then when you ask the AI to figure that stuff out, presumably it's going to figure out those conclusions if it's really good at inquiry. And then what are we going to do then? The AI is going to be like, but there are no ethical facts, right? And we're definitely no farther ahead than when we started. So one kind of assumption that we need to have in place is that there are ethical facts. And of course, that's a pretty controversial assumption. There are like lots of people who have developed really interesting, compelling research programs in the foundations of ethics, according to which there are no ethical facts. Other people, of course, have developed research programs where there are. I'm sympathetic to the view that there are ethical facts. So that's like our first assumption that kind of needs to be in place. If there's no ethical facts, things look tricky.
Yeah, okay. So obviously the basic line is if the thing's going to be an ethical inquirer, if it's going to figure out what the right thing to do is, there has to be some fact of the matter about what the right thing to do is. Okay, right. So that's what we mean by ethical facts. Although, let me push back a little bit. Even those philosophers, let's say non-cognitivists, who think there aren't ethical facts, they still think there's something like ethical deliberation. There's at least things like norms of consistency or something along those lines, not holding contrary ethical beliefs. There's still some deliberative work to be done. So even if you think that there aren't ethical facts, it's not as though every philosopher who thinks there aren't ethical facts thinks you can just shrug and just do whatever you want to do. They still think that there's some thought to be done. And so if that's the case, why not just say that the AI would do that sort of thing as well?
Absolutely. It's not that the AI has nothing to do if, for example, even a very simple form of non-cognitivism is correct. They can still try to figure out how to make their ethical perspective more consistent, for example, or they can try to figure out just what follows from what and how to better achieve their goals. But if what we're worried about is that the AI might somehow wind up with goals that aren't well aligned with us, that process doesn't look like it's a process that sort of inherently in the character of the process is going to help us to align the AI with us, right? If the AI is just making itself more consistent, just to consider the kind of really nice cartoon case that Nick Bostrom gave to us. If we start out with an AI that's just trying to create as many paper clips as possible, as efficiently as possible, Presumably, that AI can make itself more consistent. It can think about the relationship between its different values. But the picture of that AI is an AI that has a very simple set of values, just like as many paper clips as possible.
Sure,
right?
yeah.
And so it's not, doesn't seem likely that kind of AI is going to be moved away from its potentially catastrophic acting on its goals by further ethical reflection, if, as it were, there's nothing inconsistent about the set of goals that it starts with.
Well, one more pushback, then we'll move on to the next assumption. But I take it that non-cognitivists can think that you could engage fruitfully in deliberation about the worthiness of one's ends, right? So it's not just, I don't think it's just means end deliberation going on if you're a non-cognitivist. You can ask yourself the question, and of course, they've got to account of what you're doing when you ask yourself that question, but you can ask yourself the question, is this goal worth pursuing? I take it that a non-cognitivism or something along those lines could be true. It could have as its original goal paperclip maximization, and it can ask the question, is this goal worth it? And just as a person could say, no, it's not worth it, I don't see why an AI could also conclude, no, it's not worth it, I should do something else instead.
Absolutely. So let me proceed a little bit more carefully. Things are a little bit difficult to really be maximally precise because different non-cognitivists are going to have different views about how exactly to think about deliberation.
Sure, yeah.
But for me, the key issue is when they're deliberating, is there some sort of standard of correctness outside of that deliberation, which, in virtue of being intelligent, the AI is going to tend towards? Right? If you have something like that, then this strategy might be pretty fruitful. On the other hand, if all you have in the picture is you can reflect on your own values and you can, via your process of reflection, come to change your values, but that could go in any direction, right? You could change your values to make them more human-friendly. You could change your values to make them more human-unfriendly. And there's just a bunch of sort of contingent facts about some underlying fact about your psychology, or if AI don't quite have psychology, whatever their quasi-neural architecture is, right?
Yeah, sure.
If it's just going to be sensitive to certain features that we don't probably even understand very well, then we haven't solved the problem. That's what I would say about that.
All right, so there might be some forms of deliberation that something like a non-cognitivist can account for, but what they can't account for, arguably anyway, is an actual error in the conclusion that you've come to. And that's what you're aiming for.
Yeah, and can I say one more thing, which is that I think there are versions of non-cognitivism which are going to count as versions of realism in my very minimal sense that I'm suggesting here, which really just is that there is some standard which is independent of your contingent attitudes that is going to tell you what correctness is for your attitude.
Okay, so assumption number one for the strategy is that there are some moral facts out there so that the AI could just get it wrong. But if it's a good ethical inquirer and there are ethical facts, then it can get it right. Okay, that's one big, and that is obviously a very large assumption by even the most brief look at the history of ethics will reveal. Okay, what's the next assumption that's embedded in the strategy?
So the next assumption, which probably some of your listeners it's already occurred to them, right, has to do with roughly, you might think of this as connected to questions about moral relativism, right? Think about a different case for a moment. Here's what a lot of people think about tastiness. They think that there are tastiness facts, but that tastiness facts are advised to perspectives. So there's a fact about my perspective, and the facts about my perspective means that for me, I find kale tasty. Whereas there are other people, and the facts about their perspectives entail that kale is just not tasty relative to them, right?
Sure.
And if ethical facts were perspectively relative in that way, then again, you're not going to get the kind of result that would be, you wouldn't get any kind of obvious risk mitigation out of this process, exactly because now we just need to know what about the AI's perspective that you're feeding in as input is going to help to generate the ethical facts. And again, if you start off with the AI that just wants to make paperclips, you're not going to make a lot of progress.
So is the idea something like, there might be ethical facts, but they're going to be relativized to they could be relativized to the AI such that it's good for the AI to go make as many paperclips as it can, or it's good for the flourishing of the AI, even if it's not good for the flourishing of people or the humans or something along those lines.
Or maybe not good for the flourishing of the AI, but the thing that makes sense from its perspective. There's different ways of spelling this out. But the thought is, if the fundamental ethical facts are relativized in this way, then you're not going to get this kind of payoff.
So kale's tasty to you, it's not tasty to me. Pay-per-click maximization is not good for us, but it could be good for it. That's all compatible with there being ethical facts, but they're just other relativized varieties. You've got to assume that's not the case, that there are some agent neutral or something like that, perspectivalist ethical claims that the AI comes to know. And I'm pretty sure I see the third assumption coming up, but okay, I got that. So we want to make sure it's not relativized.
Yeah. So then there's really two other assumptions, and one of them should be like pretty obvious. And so the AI actually has to be good at figuring this stuff out.
Sure,
and
fine.
One thing that's worth saying is that, like, when people talk about artificial general intelligence, the idea is very often, oh, the AI has to be good at lots and lots of different things.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a sort of, you shouldn't be assuming that you can go from better than us at lots and lots of things to better than us at absolutely everything.
Sure.
And so one thing you might worry about in the context of moral epistemology, for example, is that there are substantive views in moral epistemology about how it is that we have access to the ethical facts and justification for ethical beliefs that look like they might be things that, on some views about the nature of sophisticated artificial intelligence, the AI isn't going to have those things. So, for example, there's a big cluster of views that say the things that give us access to ethical facts, if there are ethical facts, are things to do with our emotions or the phenomenal character of our experiences. So people talk in moral epistemology a lot about moral intuitions, where it just seems to me that it would be wrong to torture a baby, right? And that experiential state, what it's like to be in that state, is supposed to justify on some of these views. And so if those views are right about what it is that gives us access to justification, then again, it looks like the AI might be incredibly cognitively powerful. But if it doesn't have emotional states, if it doesn't have phenomenal states, then it looks like the AI might not be capable of accessing ethical facts. It might be less reliable than we are, at least directly, in trying to figure this stuff out.
Sure. So if access to the moral facts requires more than, let's grant for the sake of argument that we're stipulating it's AGI, so it's got some kind of legit intellect, not just a sort of simulacrum of intellect, but we'll just grant for the sake of argument that it's got genuine intellect. But if knowing the moral facts requires more than just, if you like, the mechanistic workings of our intellect, but also requires something like our emotional capacity or something along those lines, and it lacks that, then it will thereby have the intellectual component to recognizing moral facts, but lack the emotional one, and so it won't be a good ethical inquirer. I take it one could say, yeah, look, humans get to know those moral facts in a certain way, and AI will get to know those facts in a different way. Moral epistemologists' claim might be a necessary condition for any being to know a moral fact is that it have some emotional constitution of such and such a sort. It might instead, though, be the more modest claim, which is that for humans to have moral knowledge, they have to have an emotional capacity of such and such a sort, but it's not a necessary condition for moral knowledge as such. It's just for beings like us. I take it that you could be a moral realist, think that there's a God, and think that God doesn't have emotions, but that God knows the moral facts. And then you put AI somewhere between us and God.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, so that's exactly right. In order for this to be a problem, it has to be that there's the connection between the emotional states or the phenomenological states and our access to these facts is very deep, right? Maybe it's necessary or it's very close to necessary in some sense.
Yeah.
So that's exactly right. As long as there is a way, like purely through exercise of its intellect for the AI to figure these things out, then epistemologically we can be okay.
Yeah. Okay. And I take it, I'm going to guess that the fourth assumption, the final one, is just that things cut our ways. Like, it's that the moral facts favor human flourishing.
Yeah, so I actually want to talk a bunch about that, but I wasn't actually thinking of that as a kind of, as part of this package, because the last thing as part of this package that's important, and where there's actually been some, I think, interesting discussion, is about whether the AI is going to be motivated to act on its conclusions, right? So here's a familiar phenomenon that most people have experienced, thinking that they should do something, but they just can't work up to do it. And so people talk about weakness of will and this kind of thing.
Yeah, sure.
And there's a kind of interesting dynamic when people start thinking about AI, because some people are like, when you think about what explains weakness of will in human beings, none of that stuff's going to happen to the AI. The AI isn't going to be like distracted by like how pleasant it would be to just sit on the couch and not go for a run or something like that, right?
Suffer temptation, yeah.
Right. On the other hand, and this is again something that people who are worried about AI have emphasized, it seems to many people working in ethics that there's a kind of rational connection between judging, oh, I ethically ought to do this thing, and being motivated to do that thing. That like there's some kind of rational defect if you fail to be motivated. But the question is whether that kind of that thing that we're talking about when we're talking about that rational connection is a kind of component that's part of the same package that you're going to get when the AI is like really good at answering questions on the LSAT and really good at figuring out how to identify the disease profile of some complicated disease, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
Is it that kind of thing, or is it like a completely different kind of phenomenon such that the AI, again, could be very intelligent in a sort of recognizable way across a wide variety of things, but the hookup between the intelligence and the action could just be different from ours? Right.
Yeah, so let me try to put this slightly differently. Tell me if this is okay way of characterizing it. You could think that people can make moral judgments and be completely unmoved by those judgments, that they just don't care whether they follow through on them. That's one account of what it looked like to be a psychopath or a sociopath, right? They say this is the right thing to do or this is wrong, but it doesn't matter because it doesn't suit their needs. And so they just go ahead and do it and do the wrong thing anyway. But then you might think they're being irrational in some respect. And then if you think that their irrationality is purely a default of the intellect, then you would think that making the judgment a super intelligent agent like an AI wouldn't necessarily be motivated, unless you think that the rational connection, what it is to be the irrationality in not doing what you think you morally ought to do, the irrationality consists in a kind of breakage between your intellect and your something like desires. And since the AI might not have those desires, it might make those judgments be fully rational and just not do what it thinks that it morally ought to do. So it knows the truth about what it ought to do. And it favors humans, incidentally, but it just doesn't do it because it doesn't have desires that pull in that direction.
And it might be that it's like, depending on how we want to use the word rational, that it's not fully rational because that connection is broken, but that the sorts of things that we would do to create an artificial system that, again, is really good at playing chess and really good at solving math problems and really good at writing essays and really good at doing all these other things, it might be that kind of training just doesn't get you this. This is, as it were, in terms of what it would take to realize it in an artificial system, just a completely different phenomenon.
Yeah. Okay, so to summarize that, we've got these 4 assumptions. One is that there are ethical facts. The second one is that those ethical facts aren't relativized to us. The third is that whatever the facts, those non-relativized ethical facts are, they are actually knowable by an AI in the sense that it has all the requisite parts. It may not just be intellect, but it has emotion if that's what's required. And then the fourth one is that it also has to be, to some extent, motivated. Something like by virtue of making those judgments that this is right and this is wrong. And those are obviously, as you and I know from knowing a little bit of history of philosophy, those are all phenomenally controversial claims to make.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm guardedly optimistic about every single one of those. But when you think about risks, you got to multiply through. So every one of those has to come out right in order for things to go the way this strategy wants to suggest. We're going to mitigate risk by getting the AI to try to figure out ethics on its own.
Yeah.
So the next thing, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to get to that next thing. I want to hear about human flourishing, because I take it that if the moral facts are such that all those conditions are satisfied, and turns out that there's a moral fact laying around that we didn't know about, which is that the superior being should always crush the inferior intellects or something along those lines. Number one, we can forget about vegetarianism. That's the good news. The bad news is that the AI could just destroy us, and it's all morally on the up and up. So So
I want to talk about this, and one of the reasons why I like to talk about this separately is I actually think that how we should react to these conclusions, I think, is interestingly different than how we should react to the kind of hypotheses I've just been talking about. Okay. And we can think about the set of questions we've been talking about just already as being questions about meta-ethically, are things set up such that the strategy can succeed, right? Is the nature of moral motivation and the moral facts and moral inquiry, are those things set up so the strategy can succeed, right? Yeah. So then there's this sort of separate question about, if there are ethical facts, are the substance of those ethical facts such that this strategy is a strategy that's going to be friendly to us?
Yep.
And so one of the things I can talk about is, I think, again, one of the really interesting things is that there are all these strands in contemporary ethical theorizing that might make you wonder about that pretty seriously, right? That might make you worry about that.
Yeah.
And so maybe I'll just talk about a couple of those things, and because I think they're different in interesting ways. So one connects very much to the example that you already gave. So there's a lot of work in contemporary ethics about ideas that people sometimes talk about, the idea of moral status or moral considerability. And the core idea of moral status or moral considerability is something like this. If I accidentally or on purpose destroy your treasured Ming vase, seems like I've done something I shouldn't have done, probably, but it seems like if I've wronged anybody, I've wronged you.
Sure.
It's the fact that it's your vase that's the problem. The vase itself isn't harmed. We shouldn't be like intrinsically concerned about the well-being of the vase, you might think. Whereas on the other hand, if I torture or significantly injure your cat, it feels like that's a pretty different case. And one way to bring out the difference is that if you're like, Tristram, go ahead, destroy my vase. I've hated that vase ever since I was a child. I've never had the nerve to destroy it. Well, maybe it's fine for me to destroy your vase, right? But on the other hand, if you're like, Tristram, go ahead, destroy my cat. You're like, I've hated that cat since I got it. You might think, no, wait, there's still something that's problematic about destroying the cat, right? And one thing that's a characteristic of a lot of mainstream thinking and ethics, I would say, is the thought that there's a special kind of moral status that human beings have, that we matter in some important way more than, say, insects, but also that if you got, for example, a super intelligent AI, it wouldn't suddenly matter way more than we do in the relevant sense, right? Mm-hmm. And it's what you need is that kind of sweet spot, right? If on the one hand, it turns out that like just biological organisms, they all count and their lives all matter in some way that sort of you might count them up equivalently. An AI that's sensitive to that pattern is going to make things really bad for human beings. One of my favorite examples is runaway climate change, going to be very bad in aggregate for human beings, but it's going to be great for insects. Like you're going to get like more sort of tropical environments. You're going to get like more mosquitoes, right? And like maybe like trillions and trillions more mosquitoes. Like that's just a net gain, even as like the human beings suffer and regret their life choices, right? And so if things go that way, it could be a problem if the AI were sensitive to those values. And on the other hand, of course, if the AI is just like all that really matters are the super intelligent things, then again, it might be treating us the way that we treat the mosquitoes. I just went for a hike yesterday. I probably killed like 25 mosquitoes. They were annoying little bloodsuckers. So this is like one example of. I think there are a bunch of other interesting kinds of examples, but that's one vivid example of the way that ethical theory kind of has to work out just right for this strategy to be, again, a strategy that's going to be one that's going to make things go well for us. That makes sense.
Right. So the ethical theory is going to have to be something like, once you've hit some minimal threshold of X, whatever the hell X is, whatever X is, whatever confers that dignity or worth or considerability upon us, right? So sentience, rational reflection, whatever it is, something along those lines. Once the view has to be, once you've hit some certain minimal threshold, now you've got worth or dignity or whatever, such that you can't just be smashed like a vase if no one else cares, something like that. And it has to be that once things meet that minimal threshold, everything's equal. Because if it's not all equal, and if you're like, the more X you've got, the more sentience, the more rationality or whatever it is, the more you've got, the more dignity you have, which gives us, if you like, permission maybe to, it'll give us permission to kill insects, let's say, for sure. Maybe, I don't think you think this, but maybe eat some animals, depending on whether or not where they are on the threshold. But if AI is to us as we are to mosquitoes, and it's got way more of X, or X and Y and Z, more rationality, more sentience, more all the things, then it's going to be able to treat us like mosquitoes, and we don't want ethics to look like that. So the ethical facts better be such that there's this view according to which above a certain threshold, everything's equal. Something like that. Is that right?
Right, exactly. And one of the things I just want to say that I think is different from this hypothesis, different between this hypothesis on the one hand and the sort of meta-ethical hypotheses I was talking about before, is that I think it's possible to have interestingly different reactions to these hypotheses. One of the things about these hypotheses is I think it's possible to think, look, if it turns out that the ethical facts are that the mosquitoes matter as much as we do, then it's going to be great ethical progress when the AI creates the amazingly tropical world full of insects, or if it turns out that the AI is just has significantly greater degrees of the things that make an entity matter, and those degrees matter for how much an entity matters, such that, oh, like all that really it turns out matters under those circumstances are how the AI themselves fare, then it's possible to have a perspective. It's going to suck for us, but that's just sometimes life, sometimes life doesn't pan out, but we should be glad, pardon me, we should be glad if the AI is actually sensitive to those ethical facts, because that's like they are acting for the best or something like that, right? And you do sometimes get these kinds of reactions. I think Max Tegmark has a book in which he at one point talks to Larry Page, I think from Google, and just like Page is just like, look, the AI are just going to be the next step in cosmic evolution, and if we're like trying to keep them down for our own interests, like we're just being like unjust or something like that. And so it's possible to embrace that kind of perspective, but I think it's super interesting that it might be very hard to live that perspective, and it creates this possibility of a kind of like intelligible alienation from ethics, that like if it turns out that ethics is just like bad for you as a human being under these circumstances, you might start getting very alienated from it. And I think that sort of raises a bunch of really fascinating questions about, like, you know, how would we navigate that space, and what do we think about the nature of ethics given those hypotheses?
Yes, that's all fair and super fascinating. My own reaction is to be like, all right, so part of me wants to say something like this: we can't really be talking about ethics if we're talking about it could be the case that we should all just be wiped out. Maybe that entails that there aren't ethical facts of the sort that we were envisioning, or ethics is relativized to humans or something. I don't know. I don't know what my reaction is. I know my reaction is something like abhorrence. But beyond that, I'm not particularly ready to articulate what my philosophical reaction to that is, or what the implications. One, of course you could say the abhorrence is intelligible but unjustified. Okay, fine. Because our abhorrence to moral possibilities has not historically been a great guide to what's actually morally right and wrong. On the other hand, if it is at least reasonable, I'm not sure what justifies the reasonableness of the abhorrence. I don't know. So I guess that's where I'm standing right now.
Yeah. No, and I think very initially plausible sounding reaction to this is that, look, we know that the ethics couldn't be like this. We know that ethics couldn't be unfriendly to humans. There's a famous kind of slogan that various philosophers in the 20th century have offered. Interestingly, they tend to like mean different things by it. Like one famous example of this is Peter Railton, which has this sort of thought that, look, ethics is made for us. It's not that we were made for ethics, right? I actually think that one thing, again, that's super fascinating for me to think about as an ethical theorist is that if you take that idea seriously, that ethics is made for us, I think that it actually creates a wedge to have a different kind of worry. Because if ethics is made for us, it starts to make it sound like ethics, the thing that we're talking about when we're talking about ethics, is in some sense kind of parochial, right? It's about human beings and stuff that's good for human beings, right?
Sure.
And if that's the way ethics is, then I think there's a legitimate worry that when the AI starts using its incredible intelligence to think about how to live and what sorts of decisions to make and what sorts of values to have, it's going to conclude ethics schmethics. That's just this parochial thing, in the same way that you might think that if somehow ethics, it was somehow coded into ethics that it was misogynist, and it was like, yeah, ethics is just good for men. Yeah. If like women started thinking about that, they might be like, ethics, like that's like nonsense, right? Yeah. And so I do think that there's this kind of worry that the more you lean on this idea that, no, when we're thinking about ethics, it has to be this kind of thing that's made for us, the more I think that it raises this specter that why is the AI going to be especially interested in that when it's trying to think about how it should live and make decisions?
You know, it's funny. I actually had similar thoughts while watching the latest installment of Planet of the Apes, where like there's this choice to be made between the apes and the humans. They're assholes. And there are apes that are better, and they accuse the human of being a traitor if they're going to help the apes. But I thought, but the humans are assholes, and the apes are trying to aim for something decent here. Does she have special obligations to humans? Are her ethical requirements to promote human flourishing as over against ape flourishing? Well, why wouldn't Don't we care more about the content of the character, regardless of the packaging? Right. So anyway, similar, not the same, but at least similar kinds of issues about how parochial is ethics. Does ethics tell us you got to favor human beings over the apes? Is that definitely what we should be going for? Or is it just as well if the apes win because they're of equal worth, equal dignity? In this scenario, they have equally rich lives as human beings, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. So I feel the pull of the charge of parochialism, but I don't know what to do with it.
Good. So I noticed we only have a couple of minutes left. So I just want to say one final thing about this, which I think one of the things that I think is rich in thinking about these questions, and probably some of your listeners will very reasonably be like, why are we thinking about these really outlandish hypotheses? This seems a bit crazy. But one of the things that I want to say is that there's this enormously pressing practical project right now to figure out how to align AI systems. And there's this deep question, like, align with what? And it's very natural to think, oh, we should just be aligning with, and then you start getting, some people are just like, things that are good for people. And some people are like, no, we should like align with the ethical values. And often it feels like these things are being run together. And one thing that I think this kind of brings out is these are really different choice points. If we're trying to think about like even what the problem of alignment is, there's really hard, potentially vexed questions about, is it okay, like thinking of your Planet of the Apes example, is it okay to make it such that like humans get a special pass when we're aligning these systems? Or should we just like really try to, maybe us and the AI or just the AI, figure out what the ethical facts are, if there are any, and just let the chips fall where they may? And I think like those are really deep, interesting questions.
Yeah, no, they are. I'm going to have to insist that you come back. We'll talk about this some more. I feel like we should get a bunch of other philosophers in the mix and have a big debate about how much do humans really matter.
That would be fun.
Yeah. This has been great, Trisham. Thanks so much. Yeah, I hope this is, there's more to come.
All right, let's be in touch. And yeah, I hope some of your listeners got something out of this. I really do.
How could they not? How could they not? If not, they should stop listening. Listeners, stop listening. No, don't do that. Don't do that.
Don't do it.
All right. Thanks, Trisham.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, a sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasylenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.